Hello, this will be lecture number 6 for our course in social inequality. I'll be talking about the reproduction of inequality as it takes place in the educational system. It'll be the first in a series of lectures about the reproduction of inequality in social institutions. I'm going to go to the screen share now and pull up our PowerPoint. So as I have been mentioning since the very first lecture, the reproduction of inequality is a really central topic for sociologists. How, that is to say, like how social inequalities are reproduced from generation to generation. And how that reproduction of inequality is contrary to our myths of equal opportunity. The idea that is especially very strongly held in the United States, in American society, that people succeed or fail based on their merit, based on their hard work, based on their values. What sociologists are able to show is that, contrary to that myth of equal opportunity, people, generally speaking, reproduce the same sort of socioeconomic status that they were born into, that they tend to fall into place of where their background started them out at. So a social institution, as we'll be talking about it here, is an interrelated system of social roles and social norms organized around the satisfaction of an important social need or social function. The structures of roles and norms in social institutions shape and constrain individual behavior. And so sociologists consider the family, sports, religion, business, and healthcare to be examples of social institutions. The social institutions that are crucial for reproducing inequality that will be considered in this course are the educational system, the criminal justice system, and the media. These are certainly not the only institutions that are crucial for the reproduction of inequality, but they're the ones that we will be focusing in on in the next 3 lectures. And these 3 institutions roughly correspond to the way that your readings in the social inequality, the social construction of difference and inequality, how that textbook is laid out. So this week, we look at the educational system, next week at the criminal justice system, and then finally at the media. So in each of these cases, the emphasis will be on social reproduction, how inequalities are reproduced from generation to generation. And we will be taking, once again, an intersectional approach in terms of understanding how variables of class, race, and gender are intertwined and inseparable from one another in this process of social reproduction. So the educational system as a social institution. In contemporary American society, education is valued as a means of upward mobility in social class. It is thought of as the great equalizer that allows people to succeed based on their merits and hard work, regardless of their background. But contrary to this meritocratic myth of the great equalizer, sociologists study how the educational system reproduces social inequalities based on class, race, gender, and other forms of oppression. And so the key question is, how does the educational system reproduce and also serve to justify social inequality? So that's what we'll be looking at with the educational system. With the educational system, this this meritocratic myth of upward mobility is especially strong. The idea that school and schooling is the great equalizer in which people can succeed or fail, based on how hard they work, how smart they are, how strong their values are, and so on and so forth. And while as a society, we might like to believe that that's true, what sociologists have shown empirically time and time again for many decades is that the educational system and the school system actually has a greater role in reproducing inequalities rather than upsetting them or making them irrelevant. So the role of the school system in the reproduction of inequality will be our focus here. And the film that you have for this section of the course corresponds, very closely with the themes of this lecture and of the lecture that will also follow next week. And the name of this film is called The Push Out, or Push Out and it's about the criminalization of Black girls in school. And so it is inspired by a book by the same name by a woman named Monique Morris, who took a deep dive into the lives of Black girls and as well as the practices, cultural beliefs, and policies that disrupt one of the most important factors in their lives, which is education. So this is a documentary film that kind of puts the spotlight onto the reproduction of inequality and does it specifically by looking at young African-American females. And so as the film talks about, African-American girls are the fastest growing population in the juvenile justice system and the only group of girls to disproportionately experience criminalization at every education level. So in American high schools, for example, Black female students are, in comparison with their white female counterparts, are 6 times more likely to receive 1 or more out-of-school suspensions, that is to say, an expulsion. They are 3 times more likely to receive 1 or more in-school suspensions. They are 4 times more likely to be arrested. They are 3 times more likely to be physically restrained, and they are 3 times more likely to be referred to law enforcement. So the film kind of begins with this puzzle, with this very urgent social question, with this problem. How can we understand these disproportionate results in terms of suspensions, expulsions, arrest, physical restraint, reference to law enforcement, and so on and so forth? How do we explain what's going on behind these statistics? The factors that the filmmakers and Morris in her book point to, one of the concepts that they use is this concept of implicit bias. And that is a perception of good as opposed to bad girls among teachers and school authorities. And here we see an ideal norm of the white middle class that is constructed through the media, popular culture, etc. And within that ideal, Black girls are more likely to be perceived as angry, as having a bad attitude, of disrespecting authority. So the implicit bias that a lot of teachers and school authorities have has already been filtered down to them through the media and through popular culture in a way that, to say it's implicit is that it might be unconscious. It might not be something that they would say out loud or that they would directly espouse, but something that they've kind of more internalized at the level of socialization. And the filmmakers and the author really think that like popular culture and the media are really important parts where these kinds of unconscious implicit biases are passed down to people. So even teachers and school authorities have already this received assumption about Black girls as being angry, having a bad attitude, disrespecting authority, and so forth. A second key uh, concept that is utilized in this film is what they call adultification. And that is where Black girls are regularly perceived as older than they are, as to be perceived as adults when they are really children. Whereas Black boys are more often perceived as potentially violent or physically dangerous, Black girls are more often perceived as prematurely sexualized or as seen as family caregivers who should be more in charge of their behaviors, that, you know, they should know better. And so again, here we have like kind of like an implicit bias that is passed down through the media and through popular culture that is internalized widely throughout the society, that causes people, even professional educators, to have this perceived idea of looking at Black kids as if they were older than they really are, to adultify them in that sense. And here again is where we see a lot of the punitive and, you know, the sort of like the need for law enforcement and restraint, you know, is already kind of built into the way that school officials and teachers perceive these students. In the film, they talk about this expression, "You don't know what I had to do to get to school today." And that is the sort of disproportionate burden of responsibilities on Black girls in the domestic sphere of the family. The way in which, like, from a very young age, African American girls are disproportionately put in these burdens of responsibility. Finally, the film also talks about what they call the ACE score, the ACEs score, that may be familiar to some of you if you were, you know, in social work and other kinds of fields. This is basically like a 10-question survey about different types of abuse and neglect and other hallmarks of a difficult childhood. And what we see, you know, what sociologists and criminologists find time and time again is that a majority of the kids in the juvenile justice system have these childhoods with that have been characterized by abuse, neglect, and trauma. So, in other words, there's a direct relationship between a high ACE score and a propensity to end up in the juvenile justice system. That these things are actually, in fact, strongly related. So these are some of the key themes in Push Out, the film, and key themes in the larger empirical study of the criminalization of Black girls in school. This complements an article that you read in the Social Construction of Difference and Inequality, a study that was done with the title of the article is Black Girls and School Discipline, the Complexities of Being Overrepresented and Understudied. This is what we call a mixed methods empirical study that examines Black girls' exclusionary disciplinary outcomes. Mixed method is a term that sociologists and other social scientists use to describe studies that employ, like, for example, a combination of like statistical evidence with more kind of like ethnographic observation of classroom settings and school settings. So, you know, you're able to kind of combine different kinds of data, and that's what we mean by a mixed method study. So in this study, the authors examined disciplinary data from a large urban school district in Denver, Colorado, to assess racial group differences in office referrals, reasons and disparities for Black girls in and out of school suspensions, law enforcement referrals, and expulsions. So all of these disciplinary measures, which, as we know from the statistics, Black girls are much more likely to be subjected to than their white counterparts. And the authors employed a multivariate analysis to determine whether these patterns held after accounting for other identity markers. So a multivariate analysis means like literally to take multiple variables into account. So other identity markers of, not just race and gender, but of class and socioeconomic status, or other variables that might explain why we have these disproportionate rates of discipline and expulsion and suspension and so forth. The article starts with this picture that's on the right. It's a still from a viral video, a video that went viral a few years ago of a school resource officer in South Carolina who basically like through this African American girl in her high school in the middle of class, just kind of like like assaulted her, and as it shows here, like kind of tossed her over the desk, like right in full view of the whole classroom. And this incident, when the video went viral, it really put a lot of spotlight onto this question of like the police presence in schools, and the way in which like there was this like kind of connection between the school system and the prison system, like the carceral juvenile justice system. And it put into the spotlight these concepts that we'll be talking about here, a little bit later, like the school to prison pipeline, and the way in which, like, these two institutions that we'll be talking about this week and next week, the school system and the criminal justice system, are in fact, kind of related, and kind of ask people, like, why do we have so many like police officers in school? Why is it there are so many more police officers than there are like, psychological counselors or, or guidance counselors or, other kinds of things? Like, has the school system become such an institution of surveillance and social control? This video really, when it went viral, put into focus a lot of those kinds of questions about the school as an institution. So in this in this article that this team of sociologists and social scientists put together, they talk about the school to prison pipeline as having received increasing attention as the number of students funneled from urban educational to carceral institutions through exclusionary school discipline practices continue to grow at alarming rates. So that's what this school to prison pipeline concept kind of puts into focus. The authors argue that dominant discourses about Black girls inform the reasons why Black girls enter the school discipline system through office referrals and are punished more harshly for the same behavior. So again, here, a lot of the ideas, when they talk about the dominant discourses about Black girls, a lot of those are filtered down through popular culture, through the media, through this third set of institutions that we'll be talking about in 2 weeks, where these kind of like ideological and cultural narratives are kind of passed down, and sort of internalized even by teachers and school authorities. So they already have this kind of built-in prejudice, this kind of built-in preconception of these kids. The authors then seek justice by expanding urban education research to include and center Black girls, a marginalized population that is often left out of conversations around inequities in school discipline and urban education. So as we have been, emphasizing, especially in the last couple of classes, the authors really highlight the need for an intersectional approach that takes class, race, and gender into account at the same time to understand how these are fundamentally interrelated variables. So the school to prison pipeline refers to these links between the educational system and the criminal justice system in matters of student discipline and juvenile justice. How the school system basically, rather than being an institution of education for many of these students, ends up being kind of a training for the criminal justice system. Many studies have revealed that during childhood, exposures to the justice system make students more likely to become imprisoned later in life. One of the clearest indicators of the school to prison pipeline comes from state budgets, as states have generally been increasing investments in justice system infrastructure while simultaneously divesting from education. So here is a set of, a change in political priorities. And again, like the 1970s and 1980s are a real pivotal turning point in this regard, where states and the federal government began to allocate more and more money towards building prisons and building all kinds of detention centers and juvenile justice facilities and so forth, and beginning to divest from public education, and particularly public education that serves Black and brown communities, that serves inner city communities, that serves working class and poor people. There has been this systematic reallocation of our budgetary priorities as a society from educating kids to controlling them in cages. So on this issue of school funding and school quality, we find a tremendous amount of inequality. School funding and or quality has been shown to account for as much as 40% of the variance in student achievement. The funding gap is a term that is often used to explain the differences in resource allocation between high income and low income schools. Many studies have found that states are spending less money on students from low-income communities than they are on students from high-income communities. And public school funding is directly related to property values in a neighborhood. So inadequate school funding has a disproportionate impact on low-income students and high-poverty schools. So because of the way that the American society basically allocates funding to public schools, because it's based on property values, the value of the homes and businesses in a particular neighborhood, it has meant that we have this kind of systematic inequality in the amount of public school fundings. And it accounts for the reason why you have such a disparities between the quality of schools in more affluent suburbs as opposed to the quality of public schools in more inner city neighborhoods. And you know, it's visible to the naked eye. You know, anybody can drive to Pleasanton and see the quality of the schools in, you know, of the public schools in that more kind of like wealthy East Bay kind of suburbs, and then drive, you know, whatever 20 miles to Oakland and see, you know, what an underfunded public school looks like. And it's rooted in this kind of, you know, crazy system where we allocate everything according to property values. And in turn, the quality of the schools has a lot to do, up to 40%, as this statistic indicates, in terms of like why some students succeed more often than others. You know, why there are higher test scores at the school in Pleasanton as opposed to the school in Oakland. So this is the sort of funding gap that results from this way of allocating public school funding according to property values. The sociologists refer to the term socioeconomic status to refer to these sorts of inequalities. And so in the United States, a family's socioeconomic status has a significant impact on the child's education. The parents' level of education, income, and jobs combine to determine the level of difficulty their children will face in school. In American society, race and social class are interrelated in determining SES, socioeconomic status. So again, you know, as the intersectional approach tells us, these are variables that are not the same thing. Class and race are not the same thing, but they are also cannot be understood independently of one another. They are fundamentally interdependent. They are intertwined in American society. Families with a high socioeconomic status have the ability to ensure that their child receives a beneficial education, while families with a low socioeconomic status usually are not able to ensure the same quality of education for their child. And there are several factors that have to do with that contribute to this disparity, that have to do with, one, resources, and two, the environment. So again, there's a direct correlation here between socioeconomic status, the quality of the schools, and the outcomes that students you know, succeed or fail on. Now, when we look at higher socioeconomic status families, these are families, you know, that are more likely to invest into the education of their children, and that ability manifests in the ability to, you know, like shop around school districts. Parents, you know, plan where they're going to live based on the quality of the school district. I mean, this is like when people, especially more affluent people, are looking around to buy a house, you know, one of the very first things that they're concerned with and ask about, you know, might ask a real estate agent about, is the quality of the schools in that particular district. This is a huge factor for a lot of people, for a lot of parents, especially when in, you know, more kind of like affluent homeowners. They can afford to live in areas where other families of socioeconomic status, of high socioeconomic status, reside. And this congregation of high socioeconomic status families produces a school district that is very well funded. These families are capable of directly investing in their children's education by donating to the school. By having access to such funds gives the school capacity to hold high caliber resources such as high quality teachers, technology, good nutrition, clubs, sports, and books. All of these resources are conducive to an academically enriching experience. And it's kind of like, it's not that anybody wants to take that away. It's that it's more like that everybody deserves that, and yet the fact of the matter is that only those who, come from more affluent sort of backgrounds, and live in these more affluent neighborhoods really have access to those kinds of resources. If students have access to these kinds of resources, they are able to learn more effectively. And that's just, kind of like shouldn't be surprising to anyone. Whereas children of lower socioeconomic status do not have such resources. So again, it's not a question of like, that no one should have these. It's the question that it's that everyone should have access to these kinds of resources. If we were committed to being a society of equal opportunity, a society where every kid, got a chance to succeed, then, we would be more, then we would have a fairer distribution of these resources. But the fact of the matter is that we don't. So the type of environment that a student lives in is a determinant of the education that they receive. The environment a child is raised in shapes their perceptions of education. Sociologists have found that in low socioeconomic status homes, literacy is not stressed as much as it is in high socioeconomic status homes. It is proven that wealthier parents spend more time talking to their children, and this builds up their vocabulary early on and enhances their literacy skills. Children of low socioeconomic status are also exposed to a more stressful environment than higher socioeconomic status children. They worry about influences a lack of money in the household could create, such as food and bills. So we have, on the one hand, kids who go to school and are taught to, that school is something that they, kind of like enjoy. And it's a part where like, they're able to kind of like express themselves and, to develop and to be intellectually curious. And then there are other kids who grow up with a sense that school is kind of like this institution of social control, and that these kids have other bigger concerns to worry about, like, not having enough food in their stomach, not being able to concentrate because of a lack of nutrition, or because of, traumatic violent incidents that might be going on in their community, in their neighborhood. All of these factors kind of come into play in terms of understanding the way that socioeconomic status affects the quality of education that people have access to, but also the way that like education is supported in the family, and like whether kids are reading at home and learning to enjoy reading, as opposed to when students are have to worry about more kind of like pressing material concerns, like not having enough food or being subject to violence and trauma. These things are very much come into play in determining these different outcomes that we see. A key concept that sociologists use to explain the reproduction of inequality in education is the concept of the hidden curriculum. So here we get another kind of layer of understanding how the schools reproduce social inequalities, even when they don't intend to do so. Because a lot of the hidden curriculum is kind of like unintentional or even unconscious. So, what is the hidden curriculum? The hidden curriculum refers to the unwritten rules, values, and normative patterns of behavior which students are expected to conform to and learn while in school. And the hidden curriculum is normally contrasted to the formal curriculum, which consists of the formal program of specific subjects and lessons, which governments, exam boards, and schools design to promote the educational achievement of students. The hidden curriculum involves a transmission of cultural values and attitudes, such as conformity and obedience to authority, via the implied demands in rules, routines, and regulations. So, in this definition, the key thing about the hidden curriculum, as opposed to the formal curriculum, is that the hidden curriculum is unwritten. It is not a thing that is explicitly espoused in the schools. It's more like a set of values and assumptions and norms that aren't like explicitly, laid out in the schools, but but they're still like norms by which students are judged positively or negatively. So things like, obedience to authority, or, how to follow directions, the various rules and routines and regulations of the schools. These are all things that like are kind of built into the institution, even though they're not explicitly laid out in a, manual or a set of rules or something like that. So, there's kind of like the formal curriculum of, learning arithmetic and, learning language skills and, learning, all the sort of like the various subjects of the school matter. But then there's also this like hidden curriculum that no one really talks about, but is equally important in terms of like how students are judged and assessed and how students are sometimes disciplined, or sometimes rewarded. It's these kinds of like unwritten rules and norms that sociologists find that are built into the institutions of schools, and they also have a huge impact on whether students succeed or fail, whether students, learn to like school or they like education, or whether they just kind of resent it as just another thing that authorities are telling them to do. The idea of the hidden curriculum was an idea that was first kind of floated within the Marxist perspective of education during the 1970s. Marxists argued that the norms that were taught through the hidden curriculum got children ready for future exploitation at work. So, for example, that like the hidden curriculum, was always about like, the authorities know best and you need to just follow your directions. You need to memorize these facts, or you need to, kind of like just do what the teacher expects you to do. And the hidden curriculum in that, these Marxist scholars argued, was that it trained students for a lifetime of being subordinate and subservient at work. That basically like school wasn't really about it wasn't just about like teaching like people how to read and write, or do math. It was also about like teaching people to obey authority and follow directions and, take on a kind of subordinate role that they would for the rest of their lives as laborers. So this argument was espoused among many other texts but one book that's pictured here on the left-hand side of the screen by Bowles and Gintis, called Schooling in Capitalist America, was this written by these Marxist scholars, Bowles and Gintis, during the 1970s, precisely about this kind of thing. And again, it's like how the hidden curriculum of the educational system prepares working class kids for a lifetime of exploitation. So Marxists argued, for example, that accepting authority of teachers in school got children ready for accepting the authority of managers later in work. The learning of values was thus part of ideological control. Curriculum directed towards working class students often focuses on rote memorization without much decision-making, choice, or explanation, whereas the curriculum directed at affluent students typically stresses the expression of ideas and creative activities, or critical thinking skills and problem solving. So you have two kind of like different, contrasting hidden curricula here. What's being taught to, more like working class students is like, social control, like basically just like shut up, do your homework, memorize these facts, spit them back out on a test, and do what the teacher tells you. As opposed to in more like affluent schools where it's like, find your inner self and like, express your feelings and, be creative and, solve problems. And again, it's like nobody wants to take that away. I think like we would all kind of agree that that's really the thing that we want everybody to have access to. Everyone should be able to have school as an environment where they're able to express their ideas and engage in creative activities and develop their critical thinking skills and their problem solving skills. There's no reason why we can't like teach that to everyone. There's no reason why that can't be kind of embedded into the formal and informal school curriculum. And yet, what we find is that we have two different school systems with regard to these expectations about what students are supposed to be learning and how they're supposed to be learning. And so it's no coincidence. It shouldn't surprise anybody that working class and poor students more often tend to resent school and to hate school because it's just like this other institution of social control, right? And not something where they're like learning or learning how to express themselves or be creative. It's rather one where they're just kind of like subject to discipline. And so it's a real tragedy that, people are kind of, before they're even deprived of the education itself, they're taught to learn to kind of hate and resent school. And so people, never, very often, never kind of take an interest in their own education as a result, because they have these bad experiences from the time when they're very young. There's a couple of ethnographic studies and sociological theories that are directly pertinent to this. One of them is this famous study that was done in England during the 1970s and published as the book Learning to Labor by Paul Willis. Utilizing ethnographic methods, Paul Willis's Learning to Labor describes how education links culture and class in the reproduction of social hierarchy. That is to say, how working class kids get working class jobs, which is the title, the subtitle of the text. So that subtitle, how working class kids get working class jobs, should alert you to the fact that this was a text all about reproduction. The social reproduction of inequality from one generation to the next. Willis utilizes ethnographic methods. We've talked about this, in a couple of other lectures. Ethnography being a method by which sociologists or anthropologists or other social scientists go and they directly participate and observe a particular social setting. So in this case, Willis observed a school and observed like the peer groups of school kids, and this was a predominantly working class school. So Willis observed peer groups of working class teens in an English industrial town in the West Midlands during their final years at school. And those kids who were known as the lads, rebelled against the rules and values of the school, creating their own culture of opposition. Yet this resistance to official norms, Willis argues, prepared these students for working class employment. Rebelling against authority made the lads experience the constraints that held them in subordinate class positions as their own voluntary choices. So here's basically the twist in Paul Willis's argument. It's not that working class kids are prepared for working class jobs by obeying authority and by doing what teacher tells them and being a brown noser and all that kind of thing. Willis says, was actually in the opposition, in creating this culture of opposition where kids learn to hate authority, in authority as it's embodied in the teacher or the principal or other school authorities. And they learn to really resent education and hate school. And Willis says ultimately this is kind of to their own detriment, that they kind of, that this is the thing that kind of prepares them to resign themselves to a lifetime of factory labor. Keep in mind, this was a time in the 1970s, before deindustrialization had really set in, where it was still possible for working class kids to get these working class jobs in factories and in industrial manufacturing. Once those jobs start to be deindustrialized, then the prospects for working class kids get a lot worse after the 1970s and 1980s. You may remember I believe it was the third or fourth lecture where I talked about theories of inequality. Actually, I think it was maybe the second lecture. I mentioned this fellow, Pierre Bourdieu, who's really one of the most influential sociological theorists of the late 20th century, of somebody who really influenced more current trends in sociology with his theoretical ideas. And he was first and foremost interested in this question of social reproduction. And a lot of his earliest studies were in the field of education, where he looked at the school system and its role in social reproduction. So here he develops this concept of cultural capital. The concept of cultural capital was first developed by Bourdieu as part of this larger theory of social reproduction. And social reproduction he defined as the processes by which the classes in an unequal society tend to replicate their status from one generation to the next, and how the social institutions such as education, politics, and the economy tend to ensure such replication. So Bourdieu is, again, preeminently a theorist of social reproduction. And he argued that the children of middle class or wealthier parents are likely to have cultural assets, that is to say, knowledge, behavior, attitudes, and cultural experiences that ensures that they succeed in education and in society at large. So Bourdieu is conducting all of these investigations in France, going back to the 1960s. And that's where he sort of, begins to develop this idea of cultural capital, and the way in which cultural capital, kind of like with the hidden curriculum, is this, these kind of like unwritten set of norms and values that are passed down from one generation to the next, but that allow children from more affluent families to have a leg up and to be able to succeed, and that that also kind of like disparage and keep people down when they've been born into less privileged families. Bourdieu's most famous book about this is called Reproduction in Education, Society, and Culture. As defined by Bourdieu, these cultural capital refers to these social assets that include beliefs, values, attitudes, and competencies in language and culture. These are skills and knowledge which an individual can draw on to give them an advantage in social life. Cultural capital is one of the most important concepts within the sociology of education, as it goes a long way to explaining why middle-class children do better in education than working-class children. The dominance of white, patriarchal, upper-class notions of cultural capital generally excludes the ideas and beliefs of the poor and people of color. So again, here, like, we're not talking about like the formal curriculum, or we're not talking about like middle class students being necessarily like smarter than working class students. We're talking here more about like this set of attitudes, skills, and knowledge that are passed down through the family, that sort of give more privileged students an advantage, and that put, conversely, that put students from more like working class backgrounds at a disadvantage. So Bourdieu, even though he was doing this in the context of like French society, where you don't have the same kind of like interrelations of class and race as you do in the United States, Bourdieu was able to sort of begin to give us the conceptual tools to theorize how education is a site of social reproduction, a site for the reproduction of inequalities. And then we can sort of take Bourdieu's ideas and apply them to the particular circumstances of American society, where we have this fundamentally interconnected intersection of race, class, and gender. So Bourdieu's ideas, kind of provide a conceptual framework that we can then kind of build upon to understand this question of social reproduction. Now, in turning back to look at the United States and American society, the key question, both like in the past and the present, has it been about the racial segregation in the schools. The fact of the matter is that the United States, the U.S. student body, American students are more diverse than ever before, just in terms of pure demographics, in the same way that the country is more diverse than ever before, but especially young people are come from more diverse backgrounds than any generation that has come before. And yet, nevertheless, public schools remain highly segregated along racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic lines. By some measures, schools today are as segregated as they were before the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. So again, this has to do with a lot of variables, some of which I pointed out in the lecture on race and class, where we looked at home ownership and we looked at the construction, of the suburbs versus the inner cities. So the kind of like the segregation of schools kind of reflects a larger residential segregation throughout the country. And yet it's also even more so than that, as we will see, because there have been these deliberate efforts to make the schools even more segregated than the neighborhoods in which they exist. So we're likely to find even higher levels of segregation in the school system. And in some, by some measures, as it says here, this has not even changed since like the 1960s. And when we had all the civil rights legislation that was meant to break down the segregation of the schools that was, so pervasive, not just in the South, but throughout the whole country. This kind of these kind of segregated schools. According to a report, a 2022 report by the U.S. Government Accountability Office, the GAO, more than 1/3 of students, about 18.5 million of them, attended a predominantly same race, or same ethnicity school during the 2020 to 2021 school year. So that, you have like a large percentage of the students, even though we have this diverse student body throughout the country, we have millions and millions of kids that are going to schools where, there's predominantly like just one race or one ethnic group represented. So we have still like white students going to predominantly white schools, Black students going to predominantly Black schools, Latino kids going to predominantly Latino schools, and so on and so forth. Another 14% of students attended schools where almost all of the student body was of a single race or ethnicity. So again, now, we're talking about millions of kids, that even though, people their age, that they're part of the most diverse generation in the history of American society, they're still going to schools where almost everybody is of one particular race or ethnic group. And one cause of this significance, the lack of significant improvement in terms of desegregating schools, according to the GAO, is a practice known as direct secession, where schools break away from an existing district, often citing a need for more local control, and form their own new district. So this is what I meant by saying that, like, the segregation of the schools is even more extreme than the segregation of the neighborhoods, because what we see with this direct secession is often where, you have parents from, like a white neighborhood within, say, like a larger mixed race community, that kind of like break away and try to form their own school district. It's like the educational version of like gerrymandering in politics, where they sort of try to, they talk a good game about local control, but what it really means is basically like, breaking away from the public school system that might serve, kids of different races and ethnicities, and, creating these kind of segregated schools in the name of local control. So the result, as the GAO report finds, is that segregation deepens. And to quote the report, in the 10 years that we looked at direct secessions, we found that overwhelmingly those new districts were generally whiter and wealthier than the remaining districts. So yeah, this is like the same thing, or a similar kind of thing that's happening with like the gerrymandering of political districts, where certain kind of wealthier and whiter neighborhoods kind of break away from the larger urban context, the larger urban, typically mixed race communities that they're part of. And in the name of local control, they form their own district. Now, to understand like how this is a significant issue, and to understand, how this is a fight, that a struggle that continues to occur, we really have to put this in historical perspective to look at the larger history of school segregation in this country. The segregation, as it occurred in the American South, was institutionalized during the late 19th century. So after the Civil War, and after the end of slavery, and after a brief period of Reconstruction, there was this attempt. Well, not just an attempt. There was this whole campaign that was very successful to basically segregate the country, and particularly to segregate the South in terms of all kinds of various public facilities and public spaces. So segregation was institutionalized in the South at a time when 90% of Black people in America lived in the South, with the passage of what are known as these Jim Crow laws. So these laws stated that schools must be separated by race, but to offer equal amenities. However, facilities and services were far from equal, and sometimes even non-existent for minorities. So, in other words, the official line was they're separate but equal, like, well, we just don't want the two races, mixing together, but that, the Black schools will allegedly be just as good as the white ones. But the reality, of course, the way that things actually kind of played out in the South was that the facilities and the services in the Black schools were, underfunded and deeply inferior compared to those of the white schools. Secondary schools for African Americans in the South were called training schools instead of high schools, in order to appease racist whites and to focus on vocational education. So the idea was that Black kids would be allowed to go to school only insofar as it trained them to do a job. They wouldn't be learning about the arts or history, or getting the kind of well-rounded education in the humanities and things like that. The idea was that Black people would go to school just to learn a trade, a vocation, and that was something that went back to slavery, where like Black people had not been allowed to read and write, and in fact, if you like tried to learn to read and write in some, in many parts of the country, you were like taking your life in your hands. You could be lynched, you could be whipped, you could be killed, just for learning, just for wanting to be literate. So there's a concerted effort to keep people illiterate and ignorant, especially when it comes to the larger kind of educational questions. And so it was like for the segregationist whites, it was like, well, if Black people do have to be educated, it should be in this kind of narrow way in which they're learning to do a particular job, a vocation, a trade. So these Jim Crow laws were upheld in the Supreme Court the constitutionality of the Jim Crow laws was upheld in the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, which ruled that separate facilities for Black and white people were permissible. The fact that separate facilities for Black people and other minorities were chronically underfunded and of lesser quality was not successfully challenged in court for decades. It would not be until the 1950s that these Jim Crow laws would be, seen as unconstitutional. So this was the law of the land. And this was something, again, that was most intense and pervasive in the South, but was also widespread throughout the entire country. And so this was just kind of the norm throughout, the whole late 19th century and throughout the first half of the 20th century. The Brown versus Board of Education case basically overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, at least as it pertained to schools. Plessy versus Ferguson was overturned in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruling in Brown versus the Board of Education ended legal segregation in the United States, or at least ruled that it was unconstitutional. As we will see, the fight to end legal segregation kind of begins with this Supreme Court decision, but there is deep resistance within the South and among Southern whites. And so it will be played out in the next 2 decades through these really intense struggles with the civil rights movement, working to desegregate and to end Jim Crow. In the decade following Brown, between 1954 and 1964, the Southern states resisted enforcement of the court's decision. States and school districts did little to reduce segregation, and schools remained almost completely segregated until 1968, after congressional passage of civil rights legislation. Desegregation efforts reached their peak in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In response to pressures to desegregate in the public school system, some white communities started private segregated schools. So again, you have to understand that, like, as important as the Brown versus Board of Education decision was, it was really just the beginning. It was just kind of the opening shot. And it was really up to the civil rights movement and the movements for racial justice in this country to carry out what the Supreme Court had ruled. And this would be a tremendous struggle that took the next decade and a half or 2 decades to carry out. Because there was such intense resistance from the school boards, from school authorities, from state legislatures and state governments, but also from just from sort of ordinary segregationist, racist whites who didn't want Black people being Black kids being educated alongside their white kids. So we'll look at, some of the famous battles that occurred around that. In Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, for example, after the Brown decision, the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, attempted to register Black students in previously all-white schools in cities throughout the South. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the school board agreed to comply with the high court's ruling. And so by 1957, the NAACP had registered 9 Black students to attend the previously all-white Little Rock Central High. And those Black kids were selected on the criteria of excellent grades and attendance. So these were like exemplary students that were going to be be the first ones to attend this previously all-white high school in Little Rock. And the segregationists freaked out about it. The segregationists threatened to hold protest at Central High School. They physically blocked Black students from entering the school. The governor of Arkansas deployed the Arkansas National Guard to support those segregationists on September 4th, 1957. And so this image of soldiers blocking the students made national headlines and polarized national opinion. There was such vehement resistance to the idea of integrated schools. And this was, something that became a very prominent civil rights issue in the late 1950s, and then, going into the 1960s. So what happened in Little Rock? In response, the Little Rock School District issued a statement condemning the governor's deployment of soldiers to the school. The mayor asked President Eisenhower to send in federal troops to enforce integration and protect the 9 students. By the end of September 1957, the 9 were admitted to Little Rock Central High under the protection of the 141st Airborne Division, but they were still subjected to a year of physical and verbal abuse by many of the white students. As you see illustrated in this picture here, you can see this woman in the background, this white woman who looks like she's like literally foaming at the mouth, angry at the idea of a Black student, attending this high school. Claiming that Little Rock had to assert their rights and freedom against the federal decision, in September 1958, the governor signed acts that enabled him and the Little Rock School District to close all public schools. Thus, with this bill signed, the governor ordered the closure of all 4 public high schools, preventing both Black and white students from attending school. So let me try to summarize what happened here, because it's kind of crazy. It's basically like the Supreme Court issues this ruling that says that segregated schools are unconstitutional, and the sort of local officials in the school officials in Little Rock agree, and so they're going to allow 9 students to come into their school, but the governor and all these segregationist whites in Arkansas kind of freak out about this. They, try to block these students from attending. And so then the federal government, to enforce the Supreme Court ruling, sends in the military, sends in the 101st Airborne Division to protect these students against the state government, against what the governor is trying to do, and against these mobs who are threatening these students. And then in reaction to that, the governor says, okay, fine. If the federal government is going to insist that we have these integrated schools, then I'm just going to close all the schools and no one's going to go. No one's going to get an education. We would rather have all the schools closed than have these 9 Black students being educated in this previously all-white high school. That's how kind of insane this atmosphere was. An analogous thing happens in New Orleans, another kind of citadel of the American South. In 1962, New Orleans schools began a process of desegregation. So they allowed 6-year-old girls, 4 6-year-old girls, to attend the local elementary schools. And all four of these girls, these 6-year-olds, we're talking about 6-year-olds, are met with death threats, racial slurs, taunting, and so forth. On November 16th, 1960, a race riot breaks out in front of a meeting at the Orleans Parish School Board. In total, 194 people are arrested for loitering, 27 for vandalism, 29 people for carrying a concealed weapon. Stabbing and gas bombing incidents happened throughout the city, and a fight between a large group of blacks and whites broke out. So again, all of this violence, threats, you know, loitering and vandalism and concealed weapons, stabbings, gas bombing incidents, all of this in response to, 6-year-old girls attending an elementary school. Following the riot, the United States Marshals began accompanying the 4 girls to their respective schools while death threats against the children continued. And then finally, you have the attempt to desegregate higher education. Now we're going into the 1960s. In 1962, the so-called Battle of Ole Miss at the University of Mississippi, Oxford, Mississippi. The Ole Miss riot of 1962 was an incident of mob violence by proponents of racial segregation in opposition to the enrollment of James Meredith, an African-American veteran of the U.S. Air Force at the University of Mississippi, also known as Ole Miss. So James Meredith is basically this black veteran of the Air Force who's trying to enroll at the University of Mississippi. And again, we have this same kind of massive political and kind of like reaction of like mob violence. Meredith had tried to integrate Ole Miss by applying in 1961. And when he informed the university that he was African American, his admission was delayed and obstructed, first by the school officials and then by Mississippi Governor Ross Barnett. In a bid to block his enrollment, Barnett even had Meredith temporarily jailed. So again, like just like pulling out all the stops, trying to maintain segregation in the schools. When federal and U.S. state law enforcement were dispatched to accompany Meredith during his registration to maintain civil order, a riot erupted on campus, as it shows in the newspaper that's pictured here on the right side. As the mob reached a size of 2,500, they became increasingly violent, assaulting reporters and throwing Molotov cocktails and bottles of acid at the marshals. 2 civilians were murdered during the riots, and more than 300 were injured. The riot ended when over 13,000 soldiers arrived in the early morning. Over 30,000 troops were deployed during the conflict, the largest for a single disturbance in American history, at least to that time. So you have, basically it takes like an entire military operation to ensure the desegregation of this university by one student. You have to have this, you got to basically like call in the army to enforce these decisions that had been made by the court, by the Supreme Court. So that, I think, gives you a sense of like how deep this issue of school segregation has gone on in this country, and why it is such an important fight, why it is such an important struggle, and how it's still a kind of an ongoing one. So hopefully this lecture has kind of like attuned you to the importance of education in social reproduction, and then to the importance of the struggle for equal access and equal opportunity that is not just history, but continues to be something that our society faces to this day. All right, for the next lecture, we will look at the criminal justice system and its role in the reproduction of inequality. Until that time, I wish you a good day. Bye.